Last lesson focused on comparing and ordering, or comparing fractions. This lesson is going to focus on comparing and ordering fractions. So we're going to be comparing more than two fractions for this lesson. When we're comparing fractions, just a little reminder, one way that we can do it is by comparing them to our benchmark of a half. If a fraction has the same numerator, the smaller denominator is the larger fraction. If it has the same denominator, the larger numerator is the larger fraction, and then the butterfly method can be used to compare fractions as well. Now, one of the first things that's really helpful when we're comparing more than two fractions is just to start separating our fractions out. It's very unlikely that all of our fractions are going to fall either less than a half or more than a half, and so then we're going to be left with a lot fewer fractions to compare. So that would be the first thing that I would do, even before jumping into the butterfly method, because then that's a lot of multiplication that you have to do, is just separate out your fractions and identify which are greater than and which are less than a half. And then go ahead and label those with a G or an L. So 1/3, is that greater than or less than a half? It's less than. 1/4 is also less than a half, and then 2/3 is our fraction that is greater than a half. This helps us when we're ordering. Now we're going to order these fractions here from greatest to least, but it's really important that you read the specific directions that you're given for every single problem to identify, do they want you to organize them from greatest to least or from least to greatest. In this case, because I already know which of my fractions is greatest, I can go ahead and place that one on my number line first. And then all I have to do is compare my next two fractions. The only fractions that I have left are my 1/4 and my 1/3. Now, when I look at these two fractions, they both have the same numerator. So then I need to go back to my instruction about the same numerator. It tells me right here that if they have the same numerator, the smaller denominator is the larger fraction. So that would mean that 1/3 is greater than 1/4. In my order, if I'm ordering from least or from greatest to least, like I am right now, I would list my 1/3, and then I'd list my 1/4, and then I'm all done. That's it. That's all there is to it. The important part here is that the first thing we do is compare them to our benchmark. Then we look to see if we can compare our fractions any other way. If we need a little bit of extra help, we can always use that butterfly method that we talked about the other day to assist us. And we need to make sure we're looking at, well, what does it want us to do? Does it want us to list them from greatest to least or from least to greatest? Go ahead and take a look at this first set of fractions. Again, it says pay close attention to the order based on the directions. So in this case, for our first set, we're going to order them from least to greatest. Go ahead and list those three fractions from least to greatest. The first thing that I would do if I'm ordering these from least to greatest is compare them to a half. 7/10 is greater than a half, 1/5 is less than a half, and 9/10 is greater than a half. So I already have some information that's going to help me out here. I'm also going to make sure I label least to greatest so that I remember that for this set of fractions here, I'm ordering from least to greatest. That way I don't make any mistakes in putting my information out there. So my smallest fraction I already have nailed down is 1/5. If I look at my other two fractions, they have the same denominator. I'm going to be comparing 7/10 and 9/10. Because they have the same denominator, the fraction that has the larger numerator is the larger fraction, so that would be 9/10. Because I'm listing from least to greatest, I'm going to list 7/10 next, and then 9/10. So from least to greatest, I have 1/5, 7/10, and 9/10. Go ahead and solve the next problem and answer that one. Again, I'd start by making sure we determine which fractions are greater than or less than a half so that you have a good outline and good starting point. If we ordered our fractions, or rather labeled our fractions, if they were greater than or less than our benchmark, 1/4 would be less than, 5/8 would be greater than, and 1/2 is equal to a half. So here I automatically, just by doing that quick little step, have the order of my fractions. I just now need to rearrange them. I read my instructions and it says from greatest to least, so I'm going to put a G over here and an L over here, so I make sure I put them in order. And then I have my order already ready to go. I didn't have to do really any comparing. I compared them to my benchmark. So my first fraction would be 5/8, followed by the one that is equal to a half, which is 1/2, and then my 1/4. And I'm all done. That's it. All right, we have two more for you to do on this page, so go ahead and order these next set of fractions from greatest to least, like your instructions tell you. Notice how there are 4 fractions here, so you might have to do a little bit more comparing. For this set, I would still start out by comparing our fractions to our benchmark. So 3/5 is greater than, 2/3 is greater than, 3/10 is less than, and 4/5 is greater. And notice how it tells me to order them from greatest to least. So I'm going to have that information laid out there so that I do not forget. I'm going to order them from greatest to least. I can put my smallest fraction out already, 3/10. Now I need to look at the next set of fractions that I have. I have 3/5, 4/5, and 2/3. I might even go ahead and cross this one out because I've already used it, and then it's not in my way. I see that there are 2 fractions here that have the same denominator, so I can already figure out which fraction is greater. Those 2 fractions are my 3/5 and my 4/5. And because they have the same denominator, my 4/5 is greater. So now I need to figure out, well, is 2/3 greater than 4/5, or is 2/3 less than 4/5? So that would be the next thing that I would compare. I'd compare my 2/3 and my 4/5. Now maybe to compare these 2 fractions, I'm going to use my butterfly method. Totally do that. And over here, I get 10, and on this side, I get 12. 12 is greater. So 4/5 is greater than 2/3. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to list my 4/5 as my greatest fraction because 4/5 is greater than 2/3 and it's greater than 3/5. I still don't quite know though if 2/3 or 3/5 is the greater fraction. So that's going to be my next step. I have to do one more thing of comparing in order to figure out which of those 2 fractions is greater. This does take a few steps sometimes if you have some of these numbers, but that's okay. You got to follow those steps to make sure you get those fractions in order. So we've already done my 4/5 here. Now we just have these 2 fractions left to compare. I'm going to use my butterfly method to compare them, and I get 10 on this side, and I get 9 on this side. So my 2/3 is greater than my 3/5. It was important that I did that to verify and make sure I knew which of those fractions was greater. So 2/3 would come next, followed by 3/5, and then my one that was less than a half. And there's my order. Go ahead and solve this, do the same thing for the next one, but make sure you read those directions. This next set of fractions is asking us to order them from least to greatest, so I want to make sure I know that I'm ordering from least to greatest. I'm going to go ahead and start by comparing to a half. 5/10 is equal to a half. 3/5 is greater than a half. 1/8 is less, and 2/8 is less than a half. All right, so I already have my greatest fraction. My greatest fraction is 3/5. I already have my fraction that would come next because it's between greatest and least. That would be my 5/10. And now all I have to do is compare my 2/8 and my 1/8, which is pretty easy because they have the same denominator. And I know that the fraction with the bigger numerator, if they have the same denominator, is the greater fraction. So then I'd have 2/8, and then I'd have 1/8. And notice that this one took a lot less time than the one above because my fractions weren't quite as close. Just depends on what you get. That's the order: 1/8, 2/8, 5/10, and 3/5. All right, the last thing that we're going to look at is a word problem. Martina uses 3 different beads to make a necklace. The length of the beads measure 4/7 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, and 2/3 of an inch. What is the bead length in order from greatest to least? Go ahead and order that bead length from greatest to least. We have the fractions 4/7, 1/2, and 2/3. Again, just like with our other ones, the first thing I would do would be to compare them to a half. So we have greater than, equal to, and greater than. And then I'm going to label what I'm going to be listing them from, my greatest to least. And because I don't have one that's smaller than a half, but I do have something that's equal to, I know that 1/2 is going to be the smallest fraction, so I can already place that down. The last thing I have to do is just compare my 2 fractions, 4/7 and 2/3, and that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that over here off to the side. And I can use my butterfly method to help me out with that. When I do this, I get 12 on this side and 14 on this side. So I can see that 2/3 is greater than 4/7. Now all I need to do is put them on my number line in order, and I am all done. There's the answer to that word problem. All right, when we are comparing fractions, make sure you're comparing them to your benchmark of a half first, listing them in the correct order from greatest to least, and then comparing the fractions that you need to compare based off of what you have left in front of you. That's all there is to our lesson for comparing and ordering fractions. Tomorrow we're going to start reviewing our entire chapter. See you then.